Open your Bibles this morning to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. If you are using the YouVersion Bible app, on the left-hand side, there is a live events button. You can push that and then push search for live events, and you can find this morning's notes as well. I recently came across an idea of something that I hadn't previously heard before. It is called a go bag. That the idea being that when you have an emergency, it's a bag that you can grab when you're running out the door that has some essentials in it, some priority things that you want to keep. Like if the house is on fire, you grab this bag. It's got all of that kind of stuff, important documents. It's got flashlights and water and some food, or you have it in your car, or if you get stuck on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, and it's got, food and water, some of those metallic blankets they always use, and things of that nature. This go bag is supposed to be very high priority things. And so I asked my boys last night, I asked them to create a go bag for me, some of their essentials, the things that they consider to be high priority. And so that's what I have this morning in the Avengers bag. So you can tell how high priority that is. It's Avengers. And so they brought me some things. Food. They brought some food. We have some keep you sustained for quite a while. It'll lower your cholesterol in the process. Although this won't because it's empty. Keep you entertained too. They got some dominoes, some Toy Story dominoes. So that is always good. And then we got some coloring pages here, some Captain America coloring pages. They like heroes, they are boys. We got, for protection, dinosaur. You never know when you're going to need a good dinosaur to take care of what's going on. We also got, for transportation to get you out, we got a train. They brought me that. I discovered after they showed me everything they put in the bag that Liam had put in his cup. So he wanted to make sure he had some water when he left in a hurry. And finally, I guess there's a couple more things. Caleb put in a shirt. Yeah, you never want to be caught without a shirt wherever you're going. Always wear a shirt if you have to go out. That should always be a rule. And then finally, we have a Ninja Turtle. He's squishy, so you can cuddle with him if you need warmth, but he's also a Ninja Turtle, so he can fight off the bad guys. So that is the go bag that my boys came up with. And what we're going to see this morning in Exodus chapter 12 is a situation with the Israelites when they had to grab whatever they considered to be essential and get out. They had to grab and go. Here in Exodus 12, we come to the Israelites when they are at the end of their time in Egypt. They've been serving as slaves for 400 years, and God sent Moses to Pharaoh and said, you need to let my people go, or some bad things are going to happen to you if you do not do that. Pharaoh, of course, said, no, I'm not going to listen to the God of my slaves tell me what to do. And so plagues began to befall Egypt, turning the water into blood, the Nile River, their source of water, bringing a great amount of frogs on their country, all kinds of flies and gnats, painful boils that broke out on their skin, big hailstones that fell with lightning from the sky, and as we also saw last week, complete darkness over the entire nation for 3 full days. And we get to the end of that time, and Moses went into Pharaoh and said, are you going to let God's people go? And Pharaoh said, no, I'm not. And so Moses told him, well, God then said, the firstborn of every living thing in Egypt is going to die tonight at midnight if you do not let the people go. And Pharaoh said, well, that's not going to happen. I am not going to give in to this situation. I'm going to keep you as slaves, and you are not going to make me do what you want me to do. So Moses went back to the Israelites, and he told them what was going to happen, that the firstborn was going to die that night. But if they wanted to save their firstborn, they had to do something. They had to sacrifice a lamb and eat a special meal, and then they would take the lamb's blood and spread it around their doorpost so that when the death came that night, it would not strike the ones who had the blood on their doorpost. And then we get to Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 29. Exodus 12:29 says, "At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, all the firstborn of the livestock also." So, in the middle of the night, instantaneously and simultaneously, every firstborn in the nation that was not protected by God died. Now, this was a directive from God in accordance with the continual stubborn refusal of Pharaoh to do what God wanted. You see, if Pharaoh had only humbled himself before this happened, this tragedy would not have befallen the nation. Everyone was touched by this plague, as it says there, from the greatest in Pharaoh to the least of the prisoners in the dungeon were struck by this devastation. And what's interesting is Pharaoh's household, a couple of generations previous, had attempted to kill every newborn baby of the Israelites. And now every firstborn Egyptian was succumbing to the same fate that they tried to do to the Israelites. And it's not retribution that's happening here. Instead, this is God's justice on an oppressive, horribly dishonorable people. Verse 30. "And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud and great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead." And see, Moses had previously told them, back in chapter 11, that this widespread death was going to occur about midnight. And so undoubtedly throughout the night, as soon as the sun went down, the parents continued to check on their children through the night. They didn't have clocks, they didn't have watches, and so they would have kept constant vigil watching their kids with what was going to occur. And so when they finally went in at about midnight and found death, they would let out a wail, and that would prompt someone in the next house to go in and check, and then they would let out a cry as well. And then this cry extended through the entire country. What's also interesting is that word cry is also used back in Exodus chapter 3 to describe the cry of the Israelites as they cried out in their oppression to God. And so the same cry that they cried out, the Egyptians are now crying out as well. Verse 31. "Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, 'Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said.' So Pharaoh calls Moses back in the middle of the night, even though previously he had told Moses, 'If I see you again, I'm going to kill you.' But at this moment, with his son dead, that did not matter. He calls him in. He tells him to take the people and leave. He wanted them out of the country. See, things had escalated, and now Pharaoh's heir had been killed, and that changed everything. And now what's interesting, though, in every portrayal that I've ever seen of this story in the movies or on TV or Christian cartoons or whatever, Pharaoh's oldest, his firstborn, is always depicted as a child. But we know that Moses, Scripture tells us, is 80 years old at this point. And so this Pharaoh, who would not have been near quite that old at this time. He would have been maybe a decade or two younger, but his oldest son would not have been a child when this occurred. His oldest son would have been somewhere around upper 30s, low 40s. But he still would have been the heir. He still would have been the next one who was going to be Pharaoh. And he has now died. And so Pharaoh, he senses this, he sees this, he calls him in, he reverses a governmental policy that has been in place for 400 years and says, the slaves can leave, get them out of here before we all die. You see, up to this point, it seemed as though Pharaoh was going to keep the Israelites as long as possible because the plagues had not devastated his own family yet. Even though people had died, even though the Egyptian economy was on the verge of crumbling, they had lost all of their crops. Almost every single one of their livestock has been killed by the plagues at this point. But Pharaoh was still stubborn. And it wasn't until his own household was struck that he told the Israelites to leave. He was personally affected, and that changed the situation. Look at verse 32. He says, "Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." So we see here that Pharaoh concedes to all of Moses' demands. In the previous plague, if you remember from last week, Moses went in and told him, we want to leave, we want to take our kids with us, and we want to take all of our livestock with us to sacrifice to God. And Pharaoh had told them, you can go, you can take your kids, but you cannot take your animals. And so now Pharaoh is saying, take everything. Take your flocks, take your livestock, get out of here. I don't want any sign that you ever lived here in the first place. Just leave this place. And that would have been a family road trip, the likes of which had never been seen, the Israelites packing up and leaving. But then he says that interesting thing, those last three words. He says, bless me also. He asks to be blessed by the very man he has considered his enemy up to this point. He asked Moses to bless him. And the way it's phrased, he's not saying, bless me with your blessing, Moses. He's asking God's voice, Moses, to bless him, Pharaoh, who has not acknowledged God up to this point. But this has happened before, not with this Pharaoh, but there was a time when there was an Israelite who blessed the Pharaoh of Egypt. Way back before the Israelites became slaves, Jacob came to Egypt, moved with his entire family because Joseph, his son, was second in command of Egypt. And Jacob went in to see Pharaoh before Jacob died, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh in that moment. And so before the Israelites became enslaved, Pharaoh had been blessed. And now as the Israelites are leaving the nation, Pharaoh is blessed again. And by asking for a blessing, Pharaoh now, having suffered a death in his family, he is humbling himself, at least in the moment, and acknowledging the power of Israel's God. Verse 33. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. And so Pharaoh wasn't the only one now wanting the Israelites to leave. The rest of the Egyptians in the middle of the night, having death in every single household, have gathered almost in protest, telling the Israelites to get out of their nation. They thought, okay, now only one person in our house, at least one person has died. If they stay, who knows the amount of death that will fall upon our nation. We've got to get them out as quickly as possible. The attitude of the entire nation resounded with a unified voice. This has to happen now. And this may in our minds, politics is in our minds, having just had the election. This was probably one of the few times in the entire history of the world that an entire people were in political agreement about the direction of the nation. This is one issue that everybody agreed on. Get them out of here. Verse 34. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. And so the people were in such a rush to leave that they did not have time to let their bread rise. I like bread. I eat bread a lot. I would eat it. If that was the only thing that was available to eat, I would gorge myself and be like the girl in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, just a big round ball. It would be amazing. It would be a great way to go. Let me just say, just eating bread until you pop. But, my mom cooked bread, and I had the thought, you know what, I can do that. I can make some bread. And you just follow the recipe and do what it says and dump everything in, mix it up, and just let it sit there, and then you cook it, and it's easy. And so I tried it. And I can remember, this was before we were married. I've since learned to, if I have a question, ask Katie and not just assume that I know what I'm doing. So I would mix it all together, and it said, let it rise. And so I'd sit it out and just set there on the counter. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to let this rise for a little bit. And I go, oh, hey, it's gotten a little bigger. And so I'd take it and pop it in the oven and let it cook and pull it out. And if you've ever cooked something, bread in particular, and it has not had time to rise when you cook it, is a little bit hard and very, very, very dense. It is very hard to eat, but I like bread, so I'd eat it anyway. But it is very hard to eat in that moment, and you just want to toss it out. It's like a rock. You just throw it away and, hope that the garbage men don't throw their backs out as they lift it into the truck at the end of the week. And so these guys, this is what they've done. They haven't let their bread rise. They mixed it together, but they didn't have the time to let it rise. So they just wrap their dough up, wrap their bowls up, and leave before this has time to rise. They needed something to eat, but they didn't have time to get something adequately ready. What they needed was proper preparation. They needed to be prepared. Now, on Instagram, I follow this one guy who, it's kind of his health journey. He was overweight to the point of it being life-threatening. And his doctors told him, you need to change or you are not going to survive. And so he changed the way he ate. And so what he's done on Instagram is it's kind of his life journey through food. And it's a bunch of different recipes, and it's a bunch of different things. And I've never actually made anything he's posted there, but it's fun to look at different kinds of food. As I'm eating my ice cream, I'm looking at his healthy food. And so he posts all this stuff, and it's really neat. But there is one thing that I did for a while, is he would, usually on Mondays, he would call it Meal Prep Mondays. He would prepare all of his meals for the entire week on Monday afternoon. And he would pop them all in the freezer, so when it's time, he would just pull one out and eat it. So that he's not thinking, okay, what am I going to eat? And ends up eating something bad. And he would do this. And so I had the thought a couple years ago, I had to go to start my doctorate, going to class over in Fort Worth from where we lived. It was about an hour's drive. And so I'd have to get up, get myself ready, and get my breakfast and get out the door. And so I thought, well, I'll just prepare all this stuff beforehand, my breakfast anyway. I'll prepare that beforehand so I can just get up, pop it in the microwave, and hit the road. And so I made these breakfast burrito things and would cook them and get out there, and it worked great. But then I stopped doing it, and I started being late to things because, I'm not going to be on time if it means not eating. I'm going to eat, and then I'll get there when I get there. And so this whole thing is you have to prepare beforehand. And the Israelites, in the middle of the night, being told to get out of the country, did not prepare. But think about it, okay? We're going to talk about it in a second. The Israelites already knew what was going to happen. Moses had told them, God had told them, you're going to leave tonight, so be ready. But they're not ready. They're not prepared. The time was now, but they were not ready. They knew that their time of rescue was coming. It had been on their agenda for quite a while. God told them, Moses told them, and even though they knew it was coming, they were only partially prepared for it when it actually happened, having the bread, but not having it had time to rise. Their level of preparation reveals the state of their belief. Sometimes God takes us by surprise in his action because we are only partially prepared for his intervention. We pray for God's help. We even talk to other people about how God is faithful and he will take care of us. But then when God comes and does act, we are shocked and not ready. Now, this is in your notes. Partial preparation is no preparation in light of proper preparation for God's intervention. You see, if we are only properly or partially prepared, it is the equivalent of not being prepared when we should be properly prepared. Not partially prepared, properly prepared. Because God will act. God will intervene. He told the Israelites he was coming. He told them, once this last thing happens, we're leaving. So get ready. They didn't have their go bag ready. They were only partially prepared. They were told to leave by the people, told to leave by Pharaoh. And so in this moment, they grab their bread, their unfinished bread, and they leave. Verse 35. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. Now, see, God had instructed the people through Moses to go out and ask the Egyptians to borrow some jewelry and some clothing. And so the Egyptians freely offered up their things and allowed the Israelites to use them. That seems a little odd. The Israelites are slaves, the Egyptians are the slave masters, and the slaves come and say, hey, can I borrow all your gold real quick? But you got to understand there's several things that are going on in this moment. The Israelites had been born and raised in Egypt, so they knew the Egyptians their whole lives. And on a national level, the Egyptians are scared, okay? These plagues have been happening for some months, and people have been dying. The economy is crippled. Now all of the firstborn in the country have died, and the Israelites have come and said, let me have your stuff. And the Egyptians are scared. If I don't give them my stuff, who's going to die next? If I don't do what they're asking me, what is going to happen? They didn't want to anger the Israelites for fear that they would also anger the Israelites' God. But there were also supernatural things that were going on. Look at verse 36. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So the Egyptians took a liking to the Israelites, and in that moment, the Israelites were looked upon with pleasant eyes by all of the Egyptians. The Israelites took from the Egyptians everything that they wanted. They gave them the gold, the silver, they gave them clothing. The Israelites didn't know that they were about to be wandering around in the desert for 40 years, and so they are preparing for what they don't even know they're being prepared for. They're able to plunder the Egyptians in this moment without even having to raise a sword. This is the spoils of war when they don't have any weapons of war. They've been slaves for 400 years. They've never owned a sword, let alone know how to use one. And so they're going to leave with the spoils of war without even having fought for a single minute. Because this was God's war with the Egyptians on behalf of his people. And so through the plagues, the Egyptians had lost all of their crops, their livestock, and now they were losing all of their individual wealth. Look at verses 37 and 38. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And so the people of Israel pack up everything they consider to be essential in those few moments they have before they're running out the door. I tried to place this in our context, okay? Try to imagine your ancestors living in one place for 430 years and then being told they had to leave where they lived in one night. What is essential? What is necessary? What do you pack and what do you leave behind to never see again? We get a glimpse at something in this next verse, verse 38. A mixed multitude went up with them. We get a glimpse at something Paul writes about centuries later in Romans. It says that a mixed multitude went with them. And so the people who are traveling are believers in the one true God, but not all of them are physical descendants of Abraham. They were people who had heard and witnessed the power of God, and they figured they would be better off following the true God than following the fake God in Pharaoh. You see, in Genesis 15, Abraham, it says, belonged to God because of his faith, not his lineage. And so in the same way, everyone here in these two verses is considered a follower of God, an Israelite, because they believe in God. Not necessarily because they can trace their family tree on Ancestry.com back to Jacob and Isaac and Abraham. They believed, and so they were followers of God. Verse 39. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that had been brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. And so the Israelites, the those following God, those believing in God, stop at Sukkoth, and they bake the bread dough that they had brought with them. The bread dough they didn't have time to let rise. Even though it didn't contain any yeast, they still baked it because they needed something to eat. They didn't have time to let the bread rise because they were not prepared for such an abrupt exit. But I find it interesting, that last phrase of the sentence there in verse 39. It says they had not prepared any provisions for themselves. They didn't prepare to bring any food. They didn't have a box of Cheerios. They didn't have any food ready to take with them. All they had was some bread dough that they were hoping to let rise and cook on the next day. They hadn't prepared anything to take with them to eat. And so they get this bread dough, they cook it up, and they're going to use this unrisen bread as their nourishment. And so they have this great lack of preparation. A lack of preparation takes root in a lack of faith. That's in your notes on your paper. A lack of preparation takes root in a lack of faith. Verse 40 and 41. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Now, 430 years is an exceptionally long time. In our context, imagine us as Americans packing up and leaving our home for a land that we have never seen, but our ancestors were told about back in the 1500s. Would you be keen to do that? Here they are, and they're ready to do this. That's what's happening with these Israelites. They're leaving everything that they know to seek out a new home that has only been rumored about for hundreds of years. And so their lack of preparation here may be grounded in the fact that none of their ancestors for 4 centuries had left Egypt. Nothing had happened for 400 years, so they began to believe, act, and live as though their rescue from God was never going to come. Verse 42. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And so we get a unique glimpse here. God was watching. God was waiting. He was poised and ready to care for the Israelites. Even though the Israelites were not prepared, God was prepared. God was greatly anticipating his miraculous intervention in the lives of his believers. The Israelite believers were to take a time each year on a particular day to remember how God miraculously rescued them from the terrible slavery wrought by the Egyptians. You see, they needed to be prepared, but they also needed to be anticipating. God was anticipating. The Israelites needed to be anticipating. The Israelites were partially prepared, but God was properly prepared. The Israelites were apprehensive. God was anticipating. He had great anticipation. The Israelites had just taken the first step towards God's planned vision for them as a people in leaving their homes, but they were fearful. They were not ready. They were not prepared. They were not anticipating. You see, when God introduces his vision for us to follow to its fullest, we must walk in his way, fully prepared with great anticipation for what God will accomplish. So we need to be prepared. We need to be anticipating. The people, they left their homes. They're beginning their journey towards a new home. Now go over to Exodus 13. Exodus 13 down in verse 17. The people have journeyed. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, for God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. See, the shortest and easiest route to Canaan, the promised land, where they were going, was a coastal road that ran right through the Philistine territory. It was this particular road. It would have just taken them just a brief little trip to get to where they were going. But God did not let the people take the easy road. because he knew that the easy road held far more dangers than the Israelites could have foreseen or endured. The Philistines that this road went through their country, the Philistines were a very formidable foe. If you've read Scripture, you know that is a common name, the Philistines. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines a lot throughout the Old Testament. And in truth, they were not ultimately defeated for hundreds of years after this. The Israelites, the Philistines, even though they were a small nation, they were very, very tough. And they're not wiped out like many of the people of this day and age. They're not wiped out until the same conquerors who come through and wipe out the Israelites come through. So they're not even wiped out until the Israelites are wiped out. The Philistines remain in their place for a very long time. They are a tough, tough people. And God didn't want his people to face such opposition. Even though the road was easy, even though it was already laid out, a commonly traveled road, God was not going to allow the Israelites to go down that road, for they would have turned back. Because you see, the thing about easy roads, it's just as easy coming back as it is going. The Israelites would have seen how difficult it was, and they would have returned to the very thing God was trying to rescue them from. Sometimes the longer, harder road means getting to experience more of God. Look at verse 18. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. And so the weakness of the Israelites, the fear they would have had if they had gone towards the Philistines, their weakness prompted God to lead the Israelites away from the Philistines and toward the Red Sea, a dead end. They went away from the Philistines towards the Red Sea. God used the weakness of the people to direct their path and lead them to a seemingly hopeless situation. A hopeless situation that turned out to be one of the most famous acts of God's intervention, the parting of the Red Sea. And it all started because the Israelites were weak. The Israelites were fearful of what could have happened. Our weaknesses, we have to understand that our weaknesses are not limiting in the least. If anything, our deficiencies leave room for God's superiority. That's under your third place there in your notes. Our deficiencies leave room for God's superiority. God's strength is exposed in our weakness. Paul said this exact same thing in 2 Corinthians 12. You see, the people of Israel here, they went on their way equipped for battle. Now, what does that mean, equipped? We already know they have been slaves. They don't have weapons. They don't have tools with which to fight, swords and spears and things of that nature. But it says they were equipped. And everything that I could find, all of the commentaries, all of the scholars that I could find, all believe that this phrase equipped refers to how they are marching out. They are equipped in the sense they saw how the Philistines lined up for battle, and so they thought that must be the way you do it. And so they are marching out for battle in this way. You see, they have no idea how to fight. They have just seen what the Egyptians do for 400 years, and so they are trying to do that. You see, it's interesting, though, that the Israelites are not prepared. They have not been anticipating, but they are equipped. Not prepared, not anticipating, but they are equipped. And now what we're going to see is that that's the case because their equipping comes from God. The equipping doesn't refer necessarily to any kind of weaponry they would have or military knowledge they would have. It refers to what God is going to do for them and not their own competencies. Look at verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you and you will carry up my bones with you from here. So we get this kind of an aside. It almost seems like this should be in parentheses. You know, we're talking about leaving Egypt. We're talking about following God. And then we get this little side note. Moses also took the bones of Joseph with them. Now, this has been 400 years. I mean, Joseph should have been dust, but we learned from earlier in Scripture that Joseph had actually been embalmed because he was the second in command of Egypt. They had buried him in the way they bury their rulers. He was mummified, so to speak. And so they take Joseph, and they're going to take him to the promised land. Take him there. Joseph on his deathbed had made his family promise, when you leave, when God takes you away, because God had already promised it was going to happen, even though they weren't even slaves yet. God had already promised that they were going to leave. Joseph said, take my bones with you. You see, way back before any of this happened, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives were all buried in the exact same cave. And Joseph, being Jacob's son, wanted his remains to be taken back and placed there as well. Joseph had actually been the very reason that the Israelites had come to Egypt in the first place. Being second in charge, being able to provide great provisions, getting special treatment from Pharaoh. His family came and they had a special place to live there in Egypt. And so when they're leaving, Joseph wants them to take his bones with them. It's sort of a symbolic bookend to their entire time in Egypt. They came to Egypt because of Joseph, and now as they're leaving, they were to take Joseph's bones and bury them in the promised land as a symbol to the people. Verse 20. And they moved on from Sukkoth and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And so the Israelites now have traveled through Egypt. They're on the verge of leaving inhabited Egypt, and they come to the wilderness, the wild country, the place of no civilization. No civilized person takes up residence in the wilderness. You know, and even at this point, even though they are technically still in Egypt, God was leading the people away from where they had been towards his vision of his best for them. Verses 21 and 22. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. And so we see the people are going to have to be doing a lot of traveling by day, traveling by night. They would travel, they would stop and rest, they would get up, and they would travel some more. Whenever they were able, they were supposed to be moving forward, always moving towards what God had for them. Never back to where they came from, always forward to what God had planned. God provided leadership in the form of that pillar of cloud and fire to guide the people toward his vision for them constantly. God came before the people in a physical form to give them some specific direction. And then throughout their time in the wilderness, they're about to go and they're going to be in the wilderness for a while. Throughout their time in the wilderness, God's his presence is always represented by cloud and by fire. Sometimes at the same time. There's actually one instance when Moses goes up a mountain to meet with God. All of the Israelites see a giant mass of fire on the top of the mountain, and Moses just sees a giant cloud on top of the mountain. God's presence in Israel's time in the wilderness is always represented by cloud and by fire. And so the people, they're facing an unknown future with uncertain circumstances, but they know God is with them because that cloud, that fire is always there. They desperately needed God's reassuring, peaceful presence, and with that pillar being there, they knew they always had it. If they ever felt alone, if they ever felt scared, all they had to do was look, and they saw that God was with them. God says the exact same thing in Joshua 1:9. He said, the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. As the Israelites were leaving the wilderness, coming into the promised land, God said, even though you don't see the pillar of cloud and fire anymore, know that I am still there with you, even though you can't physically see me. I am there. I am equipping you in the same way he equipped the Israelites. It's a promise that stands firm throughout all faithful generations. God is with us. You see, God's presence is what equipped them for what they were about to face. Preparation and anticipation are essential to pursuing God's vision, but without being equipped, those two things come to nothing. Because preparation and anticipation are what we can bring to the table. We can be prepared. We need to prepare our hearts. We need to be anticipating what God can do. But the equipping comes from God. We can be prepared, we can be anticipating, but we're not empowered until God provides the equipping. Our level of equipment is dependent upon our level of reliance upon God. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we properly prepared or are we partially prepared for what God is going to do? And now what this means on an individual level, it's foundational in salvation. That's where it starts. Proper preparation starts at salvation. If you're in this room right now and you don't know Jesus on a personal level, then you are not properly prepared. What that means is, we are all, because of the things that we do, the disobedience we do towards God, the pride that we have, the selfishness that we have, we deserve pain and punishment after we die. But God said, I want you to spend time with me. I want you to have a relationship with me. I want you to experience heaven because I love you. And so he sent Jesus to come, die, and raise from the dead. So if we believe that, we get heaven instead of pain and punishment. If we believe that, we get to spend forever with God. And so that is the beginning place of preparation, is belief. After belief, Jesus told us in Matthew 28, the first step, the first act of obedience for a believer is baptism. After belief comes baptism. It tells everyone you belong to Jesus, but it also represents a new life that you're going to live for him. So you believe, you get baptized, and then Hebrews 10, you are supposed to become a member of God's church. And now not just a member on paper, but a member on purpose. You need to be active. You need to be intentional. You need to join God's church and do what he has for you. Jesus told us that he has given every believer specific gifts. And if we don't use those gifts in his church, then he'll take them away from us and give them to somebody else. You see, we need to be using what God has gifted us with, so that we're not just members on paper, but members on purpose. And so in a minute, we're going to have an invitation time where I invite you to come down front. I invite you to come and talk to me, talk to Micah. We'll be down here. We'd love to pray with you. If God's got something working, percolating inside you, you need to be prepared for, come and we'll pray with you about that. Come pray down here at the steps. Do what you've got to do. Deal with what you've got to deal with God. Be prepared, fully prepared, not partially prepared. But if you want to come and you want to believe in Jesus, come and talk to us. If you want to come and be baptized, come and talk to us. If you want to come and be an active, intentional participant in God's church, a member on purpose, not just paper, even if your name is already on our roll sheet on our computer, come if you're not a member on purpose, and we'll take care of that today. And so you have to ask yourself, am I partially prepared or am I fully prepared to do what God has for me to do? But then you also must ask yourself, are you anticipating a miraculous encounter with God? The Israelites were caught unawares because they were not anticipating. God was anticipating, but they were not anticipating. And then you must also ask yourself, are you equipped with God's presence to handle the day and night journey that God has set before you? Remember, your equipment from God is dependent upon your reliance upon him. Are you relying on God so you can be fully equipped? Are you prepared? Are you anticipating? And are you equipped?